Since I have only a rudimentary knowledge of the human anatomy, I wasn't sure what this meant. "What sort of pain would that have produced?" I asked. "Let me put it this way," he replied. "Do you know the kind of pain you feel when you bang your elbow and hit your funny bone? That's actually another nerve, called the ulnar nerve. It's extremely painful when you accidentally hit it. Well, picture taking a pair of pliers and squeezing and crushing that nerve," he said, emphasizing the word squeezing as he twisted an imaginary pair of pliers. The effect would be similar to what Jesus experienced. I winced at the image and squirmed in my chair. "The pain was absolutely unbearable," he continued. "In fact, it was literally beyond words to describe. They had to invent a new word, excruciating. Literally, excruciating means out of the cross. Think of that. They needed to create a new word because there was nothing in the language that could describe the intense anguish caused during the crucifixion." At this point, Jesus was hoisted as the crossbar was attached to the vertical stake, and then nails were driven through Jesus' feet. Again, the nerves in his feet would have been crushed, and there would have been a similar type of pain. Crushed and severed nerves were certainly bad enough, but I needed to know what effect that hanging on the cross would have had on Jesus. What stresses would this have put on his body? Metherell answered, "First of all, his arms would have immediately been stretched, probably about 6 inches in length, and both shoulders would have become dislocated. You can determine this with simple mathematical equations. This fulfilled the Old Testament prophecy in Psalm 22, which foretold the crucifixion hundreds of years before it took place, and says, 'My bones were out of joint.'" Metherell had made his point, graphically, about the pain endured as the crucifixion process began. But I needed to get to what finally claims the life of a crucifixion victim, because that's the pivotal issue in determining whether death can be faked or eluded. So I put the cause of death question directly to Metherell. "Once a person is hanging in the vertical position," he replied, "crucifixion is essentially an agonizingly slow death by asphyxiation. The reason is that the stresses on the muscles and diaphragm put the chest into the inhale position. Basically, in order to exhale, the individual must push up on his feet so that the tension on the muscles would be eased for a moment. In doing so, the nail would tear through the foot, eventually locking up against the tarsal bones. After managing to exhale, the person would then be able to relax down and take another breath in. Again, he'd have to push himself up to exhale, scraping his bloodied back against the coarse wood of the cross. This would go on and on until complete exhaustion would take over, and the person wouldn't be able to push up and breathe anymore. As the person slows down his breathing, he goes into what is called respiratory acidosis. The carbon dioxide in the blood is dissolved as carbonic acid, causing the acidity of the blood to increase. This eventually leads to an irregular heartbeat. In fact, with his heart beating erratically, Jesus would have known that he was at the moment of death, which is when he was able to say, "Lord, into your hands I commit my spirit." And then he died of cardiac arrest. It was the clearest explanation I had ever heard of death by crucifixion. But Metherell wasn't done. Even before he died, and this is important too, the hypovolemic shock would have caused a sustained rapid heart rate that would have contributed to heart failure, resulting in a collection of fluid in the membrane around the heart, called a pericardial effusion, as well as around the lungs, which is called a pleural effusion. Why is that significant? Because of what happened when the Roman soldier came around and, being fairly certain that Jesus was dead, confirmed it by thrusting a spear into his right side. It was probably his right side, that's not certain, but from the description it was probably the right side, between the ribs. The spear apparently went through the right lung and into the heart. So when the spear was pulled out, some fluid, the pericardial effusion and the pleural effusion, came out. This would have the appearance of a clear fluid, like water, followed by a large volume of blood, as the eyewitness John described in his gospel. John probably had no idea why he saw both blood and a clear fluid come out. Certainly that's not what an untrained person like him would have anticipated. Yet John's description is consistent with what modern medicine would expect to have happened. At first, this would seem to give credibility to John being an eyewitness. However, there seemed to be one big flaw in all of this. I pulled out my Bible and flipped to John 19, verse 34. "Wait a minute, Doc," I protested. "When you carefully read what John said, he saw blood and water come out. He intentionally put the words in that order. But according to you, the clear fluid would have come out first, so there's a significant discrepancy here." Metherell smiled slightly. "I'm not a Greek scholar," he replied, "but according to people who are, the order of words in ancient Greek was determined not necessarily by sequence, but by prominence. This means that since there was a lot more blood than water, it would have made sense for John to mention the blood first." I conceded the point, but made a mental note to confirm it myself later. At this juncture, I said, "What would Jesus' condition have been?" Meserel's gaze locked with mine. He replied with authority, "There was absolutely no doubt that Jesus was dead." Dr. Metherell's assertion seemed well supported by the evidence. But there were still some details I wanted to address, as well as at least one soft spot in his account that could very well undermine the credibility of the biblical account. "The Gospels say the soldiers broke the legs of the two criminals being crucified with Jesus," I said. "Why would they have done that?" If they wanted to speed up death, and with the Sabbath and Passover coming, the Jewish leaders certainly wanted to get this over before sundown, the Romans would use the steel shaft of a short Roman spear to shatter the victim's lower leg bones. This would prevent him from pushing up with his legs so he could breathe, and death by asphyxiation would result in a matter of minutes. Of course, we're told in the New Testament that Jesus' legs were not broken, because the soldiers had already determined that he was dead, and they just used the spear to confirm it. This fulfilled another Old Testament prophecy about the Messiah, which is that his bones would remain unbroken. Again, I jumped in. "Some people have tried to cast doubt on the gospel accounts by attacking the crucifixion story," I said. "For instance, an article in the Harvard Theological Review concluded many years ago that there was astonishing little evidence that the feet of a crucified person were ever pierced by nails. Instead," the article said, "the victim's hands and feet were tied to the cross by ropes." Won't you concede that this raises credibility problems with the New Testament account? Dr. Metherell moved forward until he was sitting at the edge of his chair. "No," he said, "because archaeology has now established that the use of nails was historical, although I'll certainly concede that ropes were indeed sometimes used." "What's the evidence?" In 1968, archaeologists in Jerusalem found the remains of about 36 Jews who had died during the uprising against Rome around AD 70. One victim, whose name was apparently Yohanan, had been crucified, and sure enough, they found a 7-inch nail still driven into his feet, with small pieces of olive wood from the cross still attached. This was excellent archaeological confirmation of a key detail in the Gospel's description of the crucifixion. Touché, I thought. But one other point of dispute concerns the expertise of the Romans to determine whether Jesus was dead, I pointed out. These people were very primitive in terms of their understanding of medicine and anatomy and so forth. How do we know they weren't just mistaken when they declared that Jesus was no longer living? I'll grant you that these soldiers didn't go to medical school, but remember that they were experts in killing people. That was their job, and they did it very well. They knew without a doubt when a person was dead. And really, it's not so terribly difficult to figure out. Besides, if a prisoner somehow escaped, the responsible soldiers would be put to death themselves. So they had a huge incentive to make absolutely sure that each and every victim was dead when he was removed from the cross. Appealing to history and medicine, to archaeology and even Roman military rules, Metherell had closed every loophole. Jesus could not have come down from the cross alive. But still, I pushed him further. Is there any possible way that Jesus could have survived this? Metherell shook his head and pointed his finger at me for emphasis. Absolutely not, he said. Remember that he was already in hypovolemic shock from the massive blood loss even before the crucifixion started. He couldn't possibly have faked his death, because you can't fake the inability to breathe for long. Besides, the spear thrust into his heart would have settled the issue once and for all. And the Romans weren't about to risk their own death by allowing him to walk away alive. So I said, when someone suggests to you that Jesus merely swooned on the cross, I tell them it's impossible. It's a fanciful theory without any possible basis in fact. Yet I wasn't quite ready to let go of the issue. At the risk of frustrating the doctor, I said, let's speculate that the impossible happened and that Jesus somehow managed to survive the crucifixion. Let's say he was able to escape from his linen wrappings, roll the huge rock away from the mouth of his tomb, and get past the Roman soldiers who were standing guard. Medically speaking, what condition would he have been in after he tracked down his disciples? Metherell was reluctant to play that game. Again, he stressed, becoming a bit more animated, there's just no way he could have survived the cross. But if he had, how could he walk around after nails had been driven through his feet? How could he have appeared on the road to Emmaus just a short time later, strolling for long distances? How could he have used his arms after they were stretched and pulled from their joints? Remember, he also had massive wounds on his back and a spear wound to his chest. Then he paused. Something clicked in his mind, and now he was ready to make a closing point that would drive a final stake through the heart of the swoon theory once and for all. It was an argument that nobody had been able to refute ever since it was first advanced by German theologian David Strauss in 1835. Listen, Metherell said, a person in that kind of pathetic condition would never have inspired his disciples to go out and proclaim that he's the Lord of life and had triumphed over the grave. Do you see what I'm saying? After suffering that horrible abuse, with all the catastrophic blood loss and drama, he would have looked so pitiful that the disciples would never have hailed him as a victorious conqueror of death. They would have felt sorry for him and tried to nurse him back to health. So it's preposterous to think that if he had appeared to them in that awful state, his followers would have been prompted to start a worldwide movement based on the hope that someday they too would have a resurrection body like this. There's just no way. Convincingly, masterfully, Metherell had established his case beyond a reasonable doubt. He had done it by focusing exclusively on the how question. How was Jesus executed in a way that absolutely ensured his death? But as we ended, I sensed that something was missing. I had tapped into his knowledge, but I hadn't touched his heart. So as we stood to shake hands, I felt compelled to ask the why question that begged to be posed. Alex, before I go, let me ask your opinion about something. Not your medical opinion, not your scientific evaluation, just something from your heart. I felt him let down his guard a bit. Yes, he said, I'll try. Jesus intentionally walked into the arms of his betrayer. He didn't resist arrest. He didn't defend himself at his trial. It was clear that he was willingly subjecting himself to what you've described as a humiliating and agonizing form of torture. And I'd like to know why. What could possibly have motivated a person to agree to endure this sort of punishment? Alexander Metherell, the man this time, not the doctor, searched for the right words. Frankly, I don't think a typical person could have done it, he finally replied. But Jesus knew what was coming, and he was willing to go through it, because this was the only way he could redeem us, by serving as our substitute and paying the death penalty that we deserve because of our rebellion against God. That was his whole mission in coming to earth. Having said that, I could still sense that Metherell's relentlessly rational and logical and organized mind was continuing to crunch down my question to its most basic, irreducible answer. So when you ask what motivated him, he concluded, well, I suppose the answer can be summed up in one word, and that would be love. Driving away that night, it was this answer that played over and over in my mind. All in all, my trip to California had been thoroughly helpful. Metherell had persuasively established that Jesus could not have survived the ordeal of the cross, a form of cruelty so vile that the Romans exempted their own citizens from it, except for cases of high treason. Metherell's conclusions were consistent with the findings of other physicians who have carefully studied the issue. Among them is Dr. William D. Edwards, whose 1986 article in the Journal of the American Medical Association concluded, clearly, the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted. Accordingly, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. Those who seek to explain away the resurrection of Jesus by claiming that he somehow escaped the clutches of death at Golgotha need to offer a more plausible theory that fits the facts. And then they too must end up pondering the haunting question that all of us need to consider. What could possibly have motivated Jesus to willingly allow himself to be degraded and brutalized the way that he did?